In this video, we will discuss Northorp Frye's essay, The Archetypes of Literature. Archetypes represent fundamental human experiences and emotions that resonate across different narratives. These archetypes serve as templates or symbols that tap into the collective unconscious, offering readers a shared understanding and connection with the stories they encounter. Northorp Frye's essay delves into the significance of archetypes in shaping the structure of literature, analyzing how they contribute to the creation of compelling and timeless tales. By identifying and understanding these archetypal elements, readers gain insights into the common threads that bind humanity's cultural and psychological experiences through the medium of storytelling. The essay is structured into three, each addressing different aspects of literary analysis. In the first part, Frye introduces the concept of archetypal criticism, where he discusses the recurring patterns, symbols, and characters in literature that reflect universal human experiences. The second part of the essay focuses on the inductive method of analyzing a text. This method involves starting with specific details and observations within a literary work and then drawing broader conclusions or generalizations from them. The third part delves into the deductive method of analysis, which involves starting from the general principles or theories and applying them to specific instances in literature to gain a deeper understanding. Let's see the summary of the essay now. Every organized area of knowledge can be learned step by step. Experience shows that learning about literature also follows a progressive path. However, we encounter a semantic challenge right from the start. For example, when someone studies physics, they say they are learning physics, not nature itself. Similarly, in the case of art, it is a subject that is systematically studied and should be distinguished from the study of it, which is called criticism. This means that it is not possible to directly learn literature. Instead, we learn about it in a specific way, primarily through the criticism. The difficulty often faced in teaching literature arises from the fact that it cannot be done directly. What can be directly taught is the criticism of literature. While literature is not expected to follow the methods of a science, there is no reason why criticism as a systematic and organized study cannot incorporate some scientific approaches. It may not be a pure or exact science, but these terms belong to an outdated 19th century way of thinking. Criticism deals with the arts and may itself be considered a form of art, but this does not mean it has to be disorganized. If it is to be connected to the sciences, it does not mean it has to lose its cultural aspects. When we look at criticism in scholarly journals and academic writings, it displays many characteristics of a science. It involves evidence rigorously, relying on established authorities, conducting systematic investigations in various fields, and applying scientific methods to edit texts. However, when students study this type of critical science, they may feel a pull away from the actual literary works. They realize that literature sits at the core of the humanities, positioned between history and philosophy. Criticism, so far, is considered a subcategory within literature. To systematically understand the subject, students often turn to the conceptual frameworks used by historians for events and philosophers for ideas. Even disciplines closely related to literary criticism, such as textual editing, can seem like they belong to a background that belongs to history or another non-literary field. This raises the possibility that these supporting critical disciplines might be connected to a central, expanding pattern of systematic comprehension that has not been fully established yet. If such a pattern does exist, it could prevent these disciplines from moving away from the core of literary study. In this context, criticism would be to art what philosophy is to wisdom and history is to action. Frye want to make a clear distinction between meaningful and factual statements in criticism because he believes that it is unhelpful to create a split between subjective, emotional, and objective descriptive aspects of meaning in literature. To generate any meaningful literary interpretation, we have to move beyond this division. The criteria for identifying a meaningful statement in criticism are not well defined. Our task is to identify and eliminate meaningless criticism. This refers to discussing literature in a way that does not contribute to building a structured body of knowledge. Personal value judgments do not belong to criticism, but rather to the history of personal preferences. They primarily reflect societal and psychological influences behind their expression. Judgments that are not rooted in literary experience but instead come from sentimentality and are influenced by religious or political biases can be considered casual. Sentimental judgments are typically based on non-existent categories or opposites or reactions to the writer's personality. The kind of casual discussion inflates or deflates the reputations of poets in a hypothetical stock market of literary opinion is not genuine criticism. This includes discussions like the fluctuating popularity of poets such as Eliot, Milton, Donne, Tennyson, and Shelley. Such conversations do not contribute to systematic study. A genuine study should always advance, while what vacillates or wavers is merely casual conversation. We also encounter a more substantial group of critics who argue that the heart of criticism lies in how literature affects the. They propose that we should focus on the study of literature itself and base the learning process on a detailed examination of the literary work. The fabric of any exceptional artwork is intricate and open to interpretation. In dissecting these intricacies, we can incorporate as much history and philosophy as we like, as long as our main focus remains on the literary work. If our attention shifts, we might find that in our eagerness, we write about literature, we have forgotten how to truly engage with and understand it. A significant portion of criticism also focuses on commentary. However, commentators do not have the same sense as researchers of being part of a scientific discipline. They are primarily engaged in providing insights and analysis in their specific areas. When we try to get a more comprehensive understanding of what criticism is about, we often find ourselves dealing with broad, general statements, thoughtful assessments of value, reflective comments, and references to research. This part of the critical field, however, is filled with statements that sound impressive but do not necessarily contain any truth or falsehood. It exists because criticism, like nature, prefers to have some substance rather than nothing at all. The approach outlined here has a potential weakness. It is primarily framed as the opposite of a background or centrifugal type of criticism, which leads to somewhat unrealistic dilemma. This dilemma is akin to the philosophical conflict between internal and external relations. Typically, conflicts like these are resolved not by taking one side and disproving the other, or by making mixed choices between them, but by attempting to move past the opposing way of the problem. It is right that the initial effort in critical understanding should involve a rhetorical or structural analysis of a work of art. However, a purely structural approach shares a limitation with biology. On its own, it consists a discrete analysis based solely on the existence of the literary structure, without providing an explanation of how the structure came to be or what its closest relatives are. While structural analysis reintroduces rhetoric into criticism, we also need a new poetics. Trying to construct a new poetic solely from rhetoric may lead to a mere complication of rhetorical terms without real progress. Frye thinks that what was currently lacking in literary criticism is a coordinating principle, a central hypothesis that, like the theory of evolution in biology, views the phenomena it deals with as parts of a whole. Such a principle, while maintaining the inward looking perspective of structural analysis, would seek to apply the same perspective to other forms of criticism as well. The first basic assumption of this hypothesis is the same as in any science, the belief in total coherence. This belief pertains to the science itself, not to its subject matter. Trust in an orderly natural world, inference drawn from the comprehensibility of the natural sciences. If the natural sciences were to entirely demonstrate the order of nature, they would likely exhaust their field of study. In contrast, criticism as a science is entirely comprehensible. Literature as the subject of a science is, to our knowledge, an endlessly rich source of new critical insights. This would remain true even if new literary works stop being produced. Given this, the idea of searching for a limiting principle in literature to discourage the growth of criticism is misguided. The assertion that a critic should not look for more in a poem than what the poet consciously intended to put there is a common form of what could be called the fallacy of premature teleology. This idea corresponds to the belief that a natural phenomenon is the way it is because some inscrutable higher power determined it to be so. While this assumption may seem straightforward, it takes a considerable amount of time for the field of study to realize that it is, indeed, a fully comprehensible body of knowledge. Until this realization occurs, it remains in a developmental stage within the framework of some other subject. The emergence of physics from natural philosophy and sociology from moral philosophy provides examples of this process. It's also roughly accurate to say that modern sciences have evolved in a sequence reflecting their proximity to mathematics. Physics and astronomy took their modern shape during the Renaissance chemistry in the 18th century, biology in the 19th, and the social sciences in the 20th. Therefore, if systematic criticism is only now beginning to develop, it is not out of place in the timeline of intellectual progress. Now we are searching for organizing principles that fall between two established points. The first of these points is the initial step in criticism, which involves the structural analysis of a work of art. The second point is the belief that there exists a field of study called criticism and that it makes or has the potential to make complete sense. We can proceed from the structural analysis in an inductive manner, gathering data and trying to identify larger patterns within it. Alternatively, we can take a deductive approach considering the implications that arise from assuming the unity of criticism. It is important to recognize that neither method can be upon exclusively. Pure induction may lead to random guesses, while pure deduction may result in rigid and overly simplistic categorization. Let's now take some tentative steps in each direction, starting with inductive approach. The unity of a work of art, which forms the basis of structural analysis, is not solely the result of the artist's unconditioned will. The artist serves as the efficient cause, but the work also possesses a form or a formal cause. The ability to revise a poem, not out of personal preference but for the sake of improvement, suggests that poems, like poets, are born and not simply created. The poet's role is to present the poem in the best possible state, while the poem itself is eager to detach from the poet's individual memories, desires for self-expression, and other personal associations. When the poet's part ends, the critic steps in. Criticism often requires a form of literary psychology to connect the poet with the poem. While studying the poet's psychology may be helpful, it primarily serves to analyze areas where the poet's expression falls short or where personal elements are still intertwined with the work. More crucial is the recognition that every poet has their own private mythology, a set of symbols or themes that they may not even be conscious of. In works featuring distinct characters like dramas and novels, this psychological analysis can also extend to understanding the interactions between characters. However, it is important to note that literary psychology only examines character behavior in relation to established literary conventions. We still face the question of the formal cause of a poem, which is closely linked with the concept of genres. Our understanding of genres in criticism is somewhat limited. Many attempts to grapple with terms like novel or epic primarily serve as examples for how rules and perceptions influence our thinking. There are two misguided views of genres that we should be aware of. The first is the mistaken idea that genres exist independently of creation, akin to mere formal conventions like the sonnet. The second is the false notion that genres evolve like biological species, a concept often encountered in discussions of the development of different forms. The truth likely lies somewhere between these two extremes. Now let's look into the origins of literary genres and start by examining the social and cultural circumstances that gave rise to them, essentially the material cause behind a work of art. This leads us into the realm of literary history, which is distinct from regular history in that its defining categories like Gothic, Baroque, and Romantic pertain specifically to cultural aspects and may not be as useful for audience outside of the literary field. While much of literary history does not delve into these categories, it still provides more insights compared to various other forms of critical scholarship. In literary history, the historian approaches literature and philosophy from a historical perspective, while the philosopher tackles history and literature from a philosophical point of view. The so-called history of ideas approach represents an early effort to consider history and philosophy through the lens of autonomous criticism. However, we sense that there is something more to uncover. We acknowledge that each poet has their own unique set of images. When so many poets utilize many of the same images, there are likely larger critical questions at play beyond simply biographical ones. For instance, as demonstrated in Auden's insightful essay, The Enshaft Flood, a significant symbol like the sea extends beyond the poetry of individual poets like Shelley, Keats, or Coleridge. It becomes an archetypal symbol in literature. Moreover, if a genre has historical origins, why does the genre of drama emerge from medieval religious themes in a manner so strikingly similar to its emergence from Greek religion? This is more of a structural question than one of origin and suggests the possibility of archetypes not just for images but also for genres. For criticism to be systematic, there must be a quality in literature that allows for such a systematic approach. An archetype should not only serve as a unifying category for criticism, but also be a fundamental component of a larger form. This brings us to the question of what kind of overarching form criticism can identify in literature. As we explore various critical methods, we find ourselves in the realm of literary history. Total literary history progresses from early, simple forms to more sophisticated ones. In this, we catch a glimpse of the potential to view literature as an intricate array of relatively basic formulas that can be studied in primitive cultures. This suggests the search for archetypes is a form of literary anthropology, examining how literature is shaped by pre-literary concepts like ritual, myth, and folklore. The relationship between these concepts and literature is not strictly one of dissent, as we observe them re-emerging in some of the greatest literary classics. In fact, there seems to be a general tendency for these classics to harken back to these fundamental concepts. This aligns with the feeling many of us have had that studying mediocre works of art, no matter how diligent, often remains a scattered and peripheral form of critical engagement. Meanwhile, profound masterpieces seem to draw us towards a point where we can discern an immense number of converging layers of significance. This leads us to wonder if we can envision literature not only as evolving over time, but also as extending across conceptual space from an unseen central point. The process of moving towards the archetype through induction is closer to stepping back from a detailed examination, similar to stepping back from a painting to better appreciate its overall composition rather than its individual brushstrokes. For instance, in the gravedigger scene in Hamlet, there is a complex interplay of language from wordplay in the first clown's dialogue to the contemplation of death in Yorick's soliloquy, which we analyze in the printed text. Stepping back, we find ourselves in the company of critics like Wilson Knight and Spurgeon, focusing on the pervasive themes of decay and corruption. As we begin to grasp the significance of this scene in the broader play, we delve into a web of psychological dynamics that fascinated Bradley. Yet we remind ourselves that Hamlet is a play, specifically an Elizabethan one. So we take another step back into the realm of critics Stahl and Shaw, viewing the scene within its conventional dramatic context. One step further, and we start to discern the archetype of the scene. The hero's declaration of love, his fateful encounter with Laertes, and the shift in his demeanor that marks the transition to the final scene, all coalesce around a pivotal moment at the grave. At each stage of comprehending this scene, we rely on a particular form of scholarly expertise. We need an editor to refine the text, followed by a rhetoric and language expert, and then a literary psychologist. Understanding the genre takes insights of a literary social historian, a literary philosopher, and an expert in the history of ideas. For discerning archetypes, a literary anthropologist is essential. Now that we have established our central framework for criticism, all these areas of expertise are viewed as converging on literary criticism rather than diverging into psychology, history, or other fields. In particular, the literary anthropologist who traces the origins of the Hamlet legend from the pre-Shakespeare play to Saxon and from Saxon to nature myths is not moving away from Shakespeare. Instead, they are drawing nearer to the archetypal form that Shakespeare reimagined. A minor outcome of this new perspective is that conflicts among critics and debates over which critical approach is the correct one tend to lose their significance. Frye then goes on to explore what he can obtain from the deductive aspect. Some forms of art unfold over time, like music, while others are presented in a single visual frame, like painting. In both cases, the fundamental organizing principle is repetition. When it plays out over time, we call it rhythm, and when it is in a visual space, we refer to it as pattern. For instance, we talk about the rhythm in music and pattern in painting. However, to demonstrate our understanding, we might switch things up and discuss the rhythm in painting and pattern in music. This means that all forms of art can be thought of in both temporal and spatial terms. For example, we can study the entire score of a musical composition at once or view a painting as the path traced by a complex dance of the eye. Literature falls somewhere in between music and painting. Its words create rhythms that approach a musical sequence of sounds at one end, and they form patterns that approach a hieroglyphic or pictorial image at the other. Efforts to get as close as possible to these boundaries give rise to what is known as experimental writing. We can think of the rhythm of literature as the narrative and pattern as the simultaneous mental grasp of the verbal structure, which encompasses the meaning or significance. When we engage with the narrative, we listen or read, but when we comprehend a writer's overall pattern, we see what they are trying to convey. The criticism of literature faces a greater challenge with what we call the representational fallacy than even the criticism of painting. This is why we tend to view narrative as a sequential portrayal of events in an external life and meaning as a reflection of some external idea. When used correctly in criticism, an author's narrative refers to the linear progression of their work, while their meaning pertains to the completeness and coherence of the overall form. Similarly, an image in literature is not just a verbal copy of an external object, but rather any element of a verbal structure seen as part of a larger pattern or rhythm. Even the specific letters an author uses to spell is considered part of their imagery, though they would only warrant critical attention in special cases, such as in cases of alliteration. So, narrative and meaning can be thought of in musical terms as the melodic and harmonic context of the imagery. Rhythm, which involves repeated movement, is deeply rooted in natural cycles. Anything in nature that we perceive as having some similarity to works of art, like a flower or a bird's song, arises from a fundamental synchronization between an organism and the rhythms of its surroundings, particularly those of the solar year. In the case of animals, certain expressions of synchronization, like the mating dances of birds, could almost be considered rituals. However, in human life, a ritual appears to be a deliberate effort to re-establish a lost connection with the natural cycle. For instance, a farmer must harvest his crop at a specific time of year. But because this is a necessity, harvesting itself is not precisely a ritual. It is the intentional expression of a desire to align human and natural energies at that time that gives rise to harvests, harvest sacrifices, and harvest customs that we label as rituals. In ritual, we might find the origin of narrative, as a ritual involves a sequential series of actions where the conscious meaning or significance is implicit. It can be observed by an outside observer, but is largely hidden from the participants themselves. Rituals tend to lean towards pure narrative, which, if it were possible, would involve automatic and unconscious repetition. It is worth noting the consistent trend of rituals to become comprehensive. All the significant recurrences in nature, like the day, phases of the moon, seasons, and solstices of the year, as well as the pivotal moments in life from birth to death, become associated with rituals. Most major religions incorporate a comprehensive set of rituals that hint in a way at the entire spectrum of potentially meaningful actions in human life. Patterns of imagery or fragments of meaning originate from oracular sources. They stem from epiphanic moments, which are sudden flashes of instant understanding that don't have a direct connection to time. Ernest Cassirer highlights the significance of these moments in his work, Myth and Language. By the time we encounter them in the form of proverbs, riddles, commandments, and etiological folk tales, they already contain a substantial narrative element. Like rituals, these oracular fragments tend to accumulate and form a comprehensive structure of meaning or doctrine from seemingly random and empirical pieces. Just as pure narrative would be an unconscious action, pure meaning would be an ineffable state of consciousness, as communication starts by constructing narratives. The myth serves as the central guiding force, imparts archetypal meaning to rituals and archetypal narratives to oracles. Therefore, the myth especially functions as the archetype, though it may be more convenient to use the term myth when discussing narrative and archetype when referring to meaning. In the cyclical patterns of the day's solar cycle, the year's seasonal cycle, and the human life cycle, there exists a unified pattern of meaning. From this, myth crafts a central narrative centered around a figure that embodies qualities of the sun, vegetative fertility, and a god or archetypal human being. The significance of this myth has been emphasized by scholars like Jung and Fraser. To address this, Frye provides the following table outlining its phases. Frye classifies myths into 4 categories. First, the dawn, spring, and birth phase. These are myths dealing with the birth of a hero, his revival and resurrection, defeat of the powers of darkness and death. Subordinate characters such as the father and the mother are introduced in the myth. Such myths are the archetypes of romance and of rhapsodic poetry. The second is the zenith, summer, and marriage or triumph phase. In this phase, there are myths of apotheosis, which means the act of being raised to the rank of a god. Then we have sacred marriage and of entering into paradise. Subordinate characters in these myths are the companion and the bride. Such myths are the archetypes of comedy, pastoral, and idyll. The third is the sunset, autumn, and death phase. These are the myths dealing with the fall of a hero, a dying god, violent death, sacrifice, and the hero's isolation. The subordinate characters are the traitor and the siren. Such myths are the archetypes of tragedy and elegy. The fourth is the darkness, winter, and desolation phase. These are myths dealing with the triumph of these powers. The myths of floods, the return of chaos, and the defeat of the hero are examples of this phase. The ogre and the witch are the subordinate characters here, and these myths are the archetypes of satire. These are the four categories of myths which Frye identifies, and they recur in different types of works written by different writers. Indeed, they constitute the basis of many great pieces of literature. The hero's quest tends to combine oracular and random verbal structures. This is evident when we observe how local legends arising from prophetic insights evolve into a narrative mythology centered around specific gods. In many major religions, this narrative mythology becomes a central quest myth, aligning with ritualistic elements. For example, in Judaism, the Messiah myth forms the narrative framework of oracles. While a local event like a flood may give rise to a folk tale by chance, a comparison of flood stories reveals their transformation into examples of the broader myth of dissolution. The inclination of both ritual and epiphany towards becoming all-encompassing is realized in the sacred scriptures of religions. Therefore, these sacred scriptures serve as the initial documents that literary critics must examine to gain a comprehensive understanding of their subject. Once the critic comprehends the structure of sacred scriptures, they can then delve into archetypes and genres. They can observe how drama emerges from the ritualistic aspect of myth, lyric from epiphanic or fragmented aspect, and epic continues the encyclopedic structure. However, some caution and encouragement are warranted as literary criticism navigates these areas. It is part of the critic's role to demonstrate how all literary genres stem from the quest myth. Yet this derivation is a logical one within the realm of criticism. Attempting chronologically expound on the derivation may lead to constructing pseudo-prehistorical narratives and mythological theories. Moreover, because psychology and anthropology are less mature disciplines compared to literary history and rhetoric, critics dealing with this material may initially appear as dilettantes in those fields. Nevertheless, books like The Golden Bough and Jung's work on libido symbols are essential studies in literary criticism. Finally, the critic studying the principles of literary form has a distinct focus compared to psychologists or anthropologists. For example, the response in literature is largely passive, while the response to significance is more active. Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture distinguishes between Apollonian cultures centered on ritual obedience and Dionysiac, ones emphasizing exposure to prophetic insights. The critic, on the other hand, would observe how popular literature often emphasizes narrative values to engage untrained minds, while more sophisticated literary attempts aim to disrupt the poet's connection to their environment, leading to moments of illumination and profound insights. Moreover, as literature evolves from primitive to self-conscious forms, there is a gradual shift in the poet's focus from narrative to significant values, a distinction noted by Schiller between naive and sentimental poetry. In criticism, as well as in history, the divine is viewed as a creation of human imagination. When critics encounter depictions of God, whether in works like Paradise Lost or the Bible, they see God as a character within a human narrative. Epiphanies are explained not as a result of possessing God or devil, but rather as mental experiences closely related to dreams. It is important to note that in art, the focus is on what is conceivable rather than what is real. Therefore, criticism, though it will eventually need a theory of conceivability, should not attempt to develop, let alone assume, a theory of actuality. We have identified the central myth of literature, particularly in its narrative aspect, as the quest myth. Now, if we aim to view this central myth as a pattern of meaning, we must begin by examining the workings of the subconscious, where epiphanies originate. In other words, in the realm of dreams, the human cycle of wakefulness and dreaming closely parallels the natural cycle of light and darkness, and it is in this parallel that imaginative thought finds its roots. This correspondence is primarily an opposition. During daylight, humans grapple with frustration and vulnerability, whereas in the darkness of nature, the powerful and heroic self emerges. Consequently, art described by Plato as a dream for awakened minds appears to have as its ultimate purpose the reconciliation of this opposition. It strives to bring together the sun and the hero, creating a world where inner desires align with external circumstances. This shared goal mirrors the endeavor in ritual to unite human and natural forces. Therefore, the societal role of the art is closely linked to visualizing the ultimate objective of human endeavor, an innocent world where desires are fulfilled, resulting in a free and harmonious human society. Understanding this, we can appreciate the integral role of criticism among the other social sciences. Criticism interprets and systematizes the artist's vision, particularly in terms of significance. At this juncture, we can recognize how religious concepts concerning the ultimate purpose of human effort are just as pertinent to criticism as any other perspectives. The god or hero in a myth holds significance because they are conceived with human attributes, yet possess greater power over nature. This gradually forms the idea of an all powerful collective community beyond an indifferent natural world. The hero, as part of this community, experiences apotheosis, a transformation into a godlike state. This new world of apotheosis starts from the cyclic nature of the hero's quest, where any triumph is temporary. Viewing the quest myth as a pattern of imagery, we primarily perceive the hero's journey in terms of its ultimate fulfillment. This leads to our central set of archetypal images. The vision of innocence, perceiving the world in a way that reflects complete human understanding. This vision aligns with and is often depicted as the portrayal of an unfallen world or heaven in religious context. We can refer to this as the comic outlook on life, which stands in contrast to the tragic perspective, where the quest is seen solely within its predetermined cycle. To further illustrate, Frye provides a secondary outline outlining the core elements of both comic and tragic viewpoints. An important principle of archetypal criticism is that the individual and universal forms of an image are identical. Both art and religion are similar and they aim at perfection. Perfection is the end of all human efforts. In art, it is achieved through dreaming or imagination, and in religion, it is through visualization. Perfection can be achieved in literary criticism, and it is the archetypal critic who does it through an analysis of the comic vision and tragic vision of life. The central pattern of the comic vision and the tragic vision in a myth is detailed below. In the comic vision of life, in a myth, the human world is presented as a community, or a hero is portrayed as a representative of the desires of the reader. Here, the archetypes of images are symposium, communion, order, friendship, and love. Marriage or some equivalent consummation belongs to the comic vision of life. In the tragic vision of life, in the human world, there is tyranny or anarchy, or an individual or an isolated man, or a leader with his back to his followers, or a bullying giant of romance, or a deserted or betrayed hero. In addition to these, there will be a harlot or a witch or other varieties of Jung's terrible mother in the tragic vision of life. Second, in the comic vision of life in a myth, the animal world is represented as a community of domesticated animals, usually a flock of sheep or a lamb, or one of the gentler birds, usually a dove. The archetypes of images are pastoral images. In the tragic vision of life, in the animal world, there are beasts, birds of prey, wolves, vultures, serpents, dragons, and so on. In the comic vision of life, in the vegetable world of a myth, there is a garden, a grove or park, or a tree of life, or a rose or lotus. The examples of the archetypes of Arcadian images are Marvel's Green World and Shakespeare's forest comedies. In the tragic vision of life, in the vegetable world of a myth, there is a sinister forest like the one in Milton's Cameo, or at the opening of Dante's Inferno, or a heath, or wilderness, or a tree of death. In the comic vision of life, in the mineral world of a myth, there is a city or one building or temple or one stone, normally a glowing precious stone. These are presented as luminous or fiery. The example of the archetype of image is a starlit dome. In the tragic vision of life, the mineral world of a myth is seen in terms of deserts, rocks, and ruins, or of geometrical images like the cross. In the comic vision of life, in the unformed world of a myth, there is a river traditionally fourfold, which influenced the Renaissance image of the temperate body with its four humors. In the tragic vision of life, this world usually becomes the sea, as the narrative myth of dissolution is so often a flood myth. The combination of the sea and beast images gives us the Leviathan and similar waterborne monsters. The provided table may seem straightforward, but a wide array of poetic images and forms can be observed to align with it. For instance, Yeats's poem Sailing to Byzantium, a well-known example of the comic vision, incorporates elements like the city, the tree, the bird, the community of sages, the geometric gyre, and the detachment from cyclic existence. It is crucial to note that it is the broader comic or tragic context that shapes the interpretation of any given symbol. This is particularly evident with relatively neutral archetypes like the island, which can signify different concepts depending on the context, such as prosperous island or Circe. It is worth noting that the tables are both basic and somewhat oversimplified. Similarly, the inductive approach to the archetype was more of an initial intuition than a comprehensive framework. What is truly significant is not the limitations of either method in isolation, but the recognition that at some point and in some way these two approaches are bound to converge. Once they do intersect, the groundwork for a structured and all-encompassing advancement of literary criticism will have been laid.